The sandwich was nothing special. 2 slices of white bread, some leftover chicken from the night before, a thin spread of mustard, and a single leaf of lettuce that had already started to go soft at the edges. Danny Hale wrapped it in the same brown paper he always used, shoved it into his worn canvas bag, and headed out the door of his tiny room on Relay Station 41. Relay Station 41 was the kind of place people forgot existed the moment they left it. It floated at the far edge of colonized space, a gray metal box spinning slowly in the dark between 2 shipping lanes that nobody particularly cared about. It had no scenery worth mentioning, no attractions, no reputation of any kind. Ships stopped here to refuel and departed again as quickly as their engines would allow. The crew who lived aboard were mostly maintenance workers, fuel handlers, and a handful of cooks who prepared the same rotating meals every week without variation or imagination. It was boring. It was quiet. And Danny had been here for 4 years. He did not mind any of it. Some people needed excitement to feel alive. Some people needed constant adventure and new horizons to chase. Danny needed a routine. Wake up, shower, fix whatever pipe or panel had broken during the night shift, eat lunch on his favorite bench near the docking bay window, fix more things through the afternoon, sleep, repeat. It was a small life by almost any measure, and he was entirely fine with that. The bench was his favorite part of every day. It sat against a wide observation window that looked directly out over the main docking bay where ships of all sizes and configurations came and went throughout the hours. Danny liked to sit there and watch them arrive and depart. He liked to guess where they were going, what they were carrying, what kinds of lives existed at the other end of their journeys. He liked the way the station hummed beneath him, a low and steady vibration that felt almost like something alive breathing slowly beneath his feet. Today was a Tuesday, which meant the chicken sandwich. Danny sat down, unwrapped his lunch, and took his first bite. Then he noticed he was not alone. A woman sat at the far end of the bench. She had not been there a moment ago, or perhaps she had and Danny simply had not been paying close enough attention. She was thin, almost too thin, with silver-blue skin that caught the docking bay lights in a strange and soft way that was difficult to look away from. Her eyes were large and very dark with no visible whites, like looking down into deep water on a moonless night. She had no ears that Danny could see, just smooth skin running along the sides of her head where ears should have been. She wore plain gray clothes, simple and completely undecorated, the kind of thing a traveler might choose specifically to avoid drawing attention to themselves. She was not human. That much was immediately obvious, but the station received alien visitors every single day without exception. That was not the detail that caught Danny's attention and held it. It was her face. She looked tired, not the ordinary kind of tired that comes from a bad night of interrupted sleep, but the deep and settled kind. The kind that moves into a person's bones and stays there for years without ever fully leaving. She sat perfectly still, staring at nothing with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked like someone who had forgotten a long time ago what it actually felt like to rest, to let the weight down even for a moment. Danny chewed his sandwich and thought about it for a quiet moment. Then he tore it carefully in half and held out the larger piece toward her without making a production of it. "Hungry?" he said. She turned her head slowly toward him. Those dark eyes locked onto his face, then moved deliberately down to the sandwich in his outstretched hand, then traveled back up to meet his gaze. Her expression did not change in any visible way, but something shifted behind her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the careful edge of suspicion. "It's chicken," Danny said. "Station chicken, so it could honestly be anything, but it tastes all right if you don't examine it too closely." She stared at him for a long time, long enough that Danny began to wonder if he had done something culturally offensive without realizing it. Some species had very specific rules about accepting food from strangers. Some had particular customs around sharing meals. He was just about to pull his hand back and offer an apology when she reached out and took the half sandwich from him. She held it carefully, as though it might break if she gripped it too firmly. She studied it with genuine attention, turning it slightly in her fingers, and then she took a small and tentative bite. She chewed slowly and deliberately. Her expression remained flat and unreadable throughout, but she did not spit it out and she did not hand it back to him. She took another bite. Danny smiled quietly to himself and went back to eating his own half. They sat like that for a while, two complete strangers on a bench at the edge of nowhere, eating a torn sandwich in comfortable silence, while ships drifted in and out of the bay below them like slow-moving thoughts. Danny finished first. He crumpled his brown paper wrapper loosely and leaned back against the window. "I eat here every day," he said, not really expecting any response in return. "Same bench, same time, more or less, in case you ever want somewhere quiet to sit again." She did not answer. She finished the last bite of her half, brushed a single crumb from her fingers with precise and delicate movements, and stood without a word or even a nod in his direction. She walked away down the corridor and disappeared around a corner without looking back. Danny watched her go. He shrugged, picked up his bag, and went back to work. There was a pressure valve on level 3 that had been hissing since early morning, and it was not going to fix itself. He did not think about the woman again that afternoon. He did not wonder where she had come from or why she had been sitting alone on a forgotten bench at the outermost edge of inhabited space. He did not notice the two figures who had watched the entire exchange from a maintenance alcove 30 meters away, dressed in dark, unmarked uniforms, their hands resting quietly on weapons that could have cut through the station's outer hull without much difficulty. He did not know that the half sandwich he had just given away without a second thought was the first gift that woman had received in 27 years that came with absolutely nothing attached to it. He just went back to fixing pipes. She was already sitting there when Danny arrived the next day. Same bench, same spot at the far end, same plain gray clothes. She sat with her back straight and her hands resting in her lap, staring out the observation window at the ships moving below in the bay. She did not look at him when he sat down. She did not say anything by way of greeting, but she was there, and Danny figured that meant something worth paying attention to. He unwrapped his lunch. Wednesday meant a rice bowl with bits of reheated vegetables and a sauce that the station kitchen called teriyaki, but tasted considerably more like salty sugar water that had forgotten what it was trying to be. He had packed 2 portions that morning, almost without consciously deciding to do it. He set the second container on the bench between them and slid it gently toward her without saying a word about it. She looked down at the container for a moment. Then she picked it up and opened it carefully. She ate slowly, examining each bite before putting it in her mouth, as though she was genuinely trying to understand the food at some deeper level rather than simply tasting it. "The sauce is a bit strange," Danny said conversationally. "I know, but the rice is decent enough if you don't think about it too hard." She said nothing, but she continued eating. When she finished, she set the empty container down and folded her hands again with the same careful precision as before. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching a cargo freighter maneuver its bulk slowly into position at the far end of the bay. Then Danny said, "I'm Danny, by the way. I fix things around here. Pipes mostly, sometimes the air recyclers when they get temperamental. Once I had to fix a door that kept opening and closing entirely on its own for no apparent reason, which was honestly more unsettling than technically difficult." She turned her head slightly in his direction. Those deep, dark eyes studied his face for a considering moment. Then she spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and smooth, like a stone settling slowly into still, calm water. "Sail," she said. "Nice to meet you, Sail." She did not say nice to meet you back. She simply turned to look at the window again. But Danny did not mind that at all. Some people took their own time to warm up to things. He had a cousin back on Earth who refused to speak to anyone for the first full hour after waking up every morning without exception. People were different from each other in all sorts of ways. Aliens were probably even more different, and that seemed entirely reasonable to him. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, Danny had started packing lunch for two every morning without even consciously thinking about it anymore. It had simply become part of the routine without announcement or decision. Wake up, shower, pack two lunches, head out, meet Sale on the bench, eat, talk a little, go back to work. The talking part grew slowly and at its own pace. Sale never said much about herself directly. When Danny asked where she was from, she said simply, far away. When he asked what she did, she paused for a noticeably long time and then said she as traveling. When he asked if she was all right, because she always carried that look of deep and settled exhaustion, she changed the subject smoothly and redirected the conversation toward him instead. But she asked Danny questions, strange and specific ones that he wouldn't have expected. "Why did you offer me food?" she asked one afternoon while Danny was eating his sandwich and explaining at some length why mustard was definitively superior to mayonnaise in every meaningful respect. "Because you looked hungry," he said. "You did not know me. You did not know my species, my rank, my name. You knew absolutely nothing about who I was, and yet you gave me half of your only meal." Danny shrugged. It was just a sandwich. "But why?" she pressed. He thought about it honestly for a moment. "I guess because you were sitting alone and you looked like you were having a difficult day. That's enough reason, isn't it?" She went quiet after that. She stared out the window for a long and thoughtful time, and Danny had the distinct feeling that his answer had reached something deep inside her that she had not expected to feel touched. "Another afternoon," she asked. "Do you not want anything in return?" "In return for what?" "For the food, the company, your time." Danny laughed softly. "Sale, I fix toilets for a living on a station that most of the galaxy has never heard of. I'm not exactly a man with complicated long-term plans. I just genuinely like having someone to eat lunch with." She looked at him as though he had said the most confusing thing she had encountered in recent memory. "Not everything has to be a transaction," he added, chewing thoughtfully. "Sometimes a sandwich is just a sandwich." That evening, Danny wandered to the common area to watch the news on the large wall screen. Most of it was the usual background noise of the galaxy. Trade disputes, a new colony breaking ground somewhere in the mid-systems, a fuel shortage affecting a shipping route he had never personally used. Then the screen shifted to something slightly different, a brief report about increased security protocols throughout the outer territories. Something about an elevated presence of Ascendancy vessels moving through the region. The reporter mentioned that the Empress herself was rumored to be conducting a quiet tour of the border regions, though no official statement confirming this had been released. Danny watched the segment with mild and passing interest while finishing his evening snack. He did not know a great deal about the Ascendancy beyond the basics. He knew it was the largest governing body in the known galaxy, that it held authority over more than 900 distinct species, and that its ruling line had been in power for considerably longer than Danny had been alive. That was roughly the extent of his knowledge. Politics had never held much appeal for him. He did notice something slightly odd, though, thinking back on the past several days. There had been more security officers walking the station corridors than usual. Aliens in dark uniforms he did not recognize from any standard registry. They moved always in pairs, always watching, always quiet in a way that suggested professional training rather than simple caution. And there was a ship docked in Bay 7, the restricted bay that was not typically available to visiting traffic. It had been there since the same day Sale first appeared on the bench. The ship was sleek and very black and carried absolutely no markings of any kind. No registration numbers, no flags, nothing that identified it or its origin. Danny thought briefly about mentioning it to Sale the next day. Then he decided it was almost certainly none of his business. He turned off the screen and went to bed. 2 weeks in, Danny brought an orange. He placed it on the bench between them like it was nothing particularly noteworthy, just an additional element of the meal. Sale picked it up and turned it slowly in her hands, running her fingers with evident curiosity over the textured and dimpled skin. She had never encountered one before, clearly. Danny watched her examine it with a small and genuine grin. "You peel it," he said. "Here, let me show you." He took it back gently, pressed his thumb into the top, and peeled the skin away in one long, continuous spiral. The scent hit the air immediately, bright and sharp and unmistakable. Sale's nostrils flared slightly. She leaned forward with unconscious interest, her dark eyes following the careful motion of his hands as he separated the individual segments and held one out toward her. She bit into it. Juice ran down her chin. Her eyes went wide, and for the first time since Danny had met her on that bench, her expression changed completely and without reservation. She looked genuinely surprised, fully and openly surprised, like someone who had slowly forgotten over many years that the world could still offer something entirely unexpected and good. "Good?" Danny asked. "What is this?" she whispered. "An orange, fruit that grows on trees back on Earth." He handed her the rest of the segments. "Have all of it. I've got more things in my bag." She ate every segment. She ate them slowly, one at a time, with her eyes half closed and her full attention on the experience. When she finished, she held the empty peel in both hands and stared at it with an expression that suggested she was treating it as something worth keeping. That was the day things shifted meaningfully between them. Sale started talking more after that. Not a great deal at once, and never directly about herself in any revealing way, but enough that Danny could feel the walls she maintained coming down one careful brick at a time. She asked him about Earth with genuine and focused curiosity. What did rain feel like against your skin? What was the ocean actually like when you stood at its edge? Were the trees really as tall as the images suggested? Danny described all of it as best he could, reaching for words that might carry the weight of things he had always taken for granted. And Sale listened with such complete and concentrated attention that he sometimes forgot entirely that she wasn't human. He brought her different foods to try each day, building a small, informal survey of Earth flavors. She loved apples with an enthusiasm that surprised him. She was deeply fascinated by bread in all its forms, how impossibly soft it was, the remarkable variety of shapes it could take, the way it could be so many different things. She liked rice. She tolerated the station's mystery meat with admirable composure, but cheese was where the experiment reached its definitive conclusion. Danny handed her a small cube of cheddar with some confidence, and she placed it in her mouth, chewed exactly once, and then slowly and with extraordinary precision removed it with 2 fingers and set it on the bench beside her with the careful, deliberate manner of someone disposing of evidence of a small but clear crime. "No," she said. Danny tried not to laugh. He failed. "What have you done to that milk?" Sale said flatly. It was the closest thing to a joke she had ever made in his presence, and Danny laughed so hard he nearly dropped the rest of his lunch entirely. She almost smiled. Not quite all the way, but the corner of her mouth moved just perceptibly, and Danny counted that as a meaningful and hard-won victory. Over the following days, their conversations found their way into deeper territory. Sale told him she held a position of some significant responsibility. Danny assumed she was perhaps a regional administrator or a senior trade official of some kind. She carried that particular energy about her, the quiet and settled weight of someone who bore more than they ever showed to anyone. "It must be a great deal to carry," he said one afternoon. "It is everything," she replied. "Every decision I make reaches lives I will never personally meet. I carry their futures without ever knowing their names or their faces." Danny let that sit between them for a moment without rushing to fill it. "That sounds incredibly lonely," he said. Sale did not answer immediately. She looked out the window at a large cargo ship pulling slowly and carefully into its dock below. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it from her. People speak to me because protocol requires it. They smile because it is expected of them in my presence. They agree with me because disagreement carries consequences they cannot afford to face. I have not had a real conversation in years. Not a single one where the other person simply said what they were actually thinking without first calculating what it might cost them to say it. She paused. Until this bench. Danny did not have words for that, so he handed her an apple slice and said, "Well, I think your opinion on cheese is completely wrong, but I genuinely respect your honesty about it." She almost smiled again. That night, walking back to his quarters after finishing a late repair job on level 6, Danny passed through the common area. The big screen was cycling through overnight news feeds, and he stopped briefly to stretch out his back and glanced at whatever was broadcasting. A reporter was speaking over footage of massive ships moving in precise formation against a backdrop of stars. Thousands of vessels spread across a field of space, so vast it made Relay Station 41 look like a single grain of sand lost in a desert. The story concerned the Ascendancy. The reporter explained that the Empress had been conducting a quiet and private inspection of the outer territories for several weeks, with no public appearances scheduled and no official events on record. Just a personal tour with a carefully selected security detail. The broadcast displayed a single photograph of the Empress, taken from considerable distance at some formal ceremony from years past. She stood on an elevated platform above a crowd of many thousands, dressed in white and silver, her posture perfectly rigid, her face entirely unreadable from that distance. She looked powerful and distant and completely, utterly alone in the way that only people surrounded by everyone can sometimes be. Danny squinted at the screen. Something about the shape of her, the specific way she held herself even in a photograph taken from far away, tugged at something at the edge of his thoughts. But the image was small and slightly blurry with distance, and the thought did not form into anything solid or clear before slipping away. He yawned, scratched the back of his head, and walked the rest of the way to his room. He had an early shift in the morning, and he needed to remember to pack an extra apple. Sale really liked the apples. Behind him, the screen continued cycling. The Empress stared out from the archived photograph with dark eyes that held very little light in them at all. Danny knew something was wrong the moment he arrived at the bench and saw her. Sale was already there, but she was not sitting the way she always did. Her back was not straight. Her hands were not folded neatly in her lap with their usual controlled precision. She was leaning forward slightly, her shoulders pulled inward, her head lowered toward the window. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her look, as though something essential inside had quietly collapsed, and the rest of her was working hard just to hold the familiar shape together from the outside. He sat down beside her without making any comment about what he was observing. He simply opened his bag and set out the food between them the way he always did. 2 sandwiches, an apple already sliced into careful pieces, a small plastic cup of juice he had taken from the mess hall. He pushed her share toward her with his usual quiet gesture. She did not touch it. Danny ate in silence for a few minutes, watching the bay below without comment. Then he said quietly, "Bad day." Sale did not move for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different from any way he had heard it before. The smooth and careful control she always maintained was gone completely. Her voice sounded thin, like glass that had been struck one too many times and was holding together by diminishing margin alone. "I made a decision last night," she said. "A necessary one, the correct one by every available measure. Every advisor I have confirmed it. Every calculation supported it without exception." She stopped. Her fingers tightened around each other in her lap. A fleet was approaching a populated system, 12 million civilians. If I gave the order to redirect our defense forces into position, those 12 million people would be protected and saved. but the route the fleet was using passed directly through a cluster of small colonies, mining settlements, outposts, scattered communities. 4,700 people. She paused. The fleet would pass through them on the way. Danny listened without moving. He did not interrupt. "I gave the order," she said. "The 12 million are safe. The fleet was stopped. But those colonies are gone. 4,700 people, families, children, workers who had done nothing wrong and were simply living in the wrong location at the wrong moment." Her voice broke on the last word. She pressed her lips together tightly and breathed carefully through her nose, working to maintain something like composure. "I did the math," she whispered. "I always do the math, and the math was right, but the math does not scream. The math does not have faces." Danny set his sandwich down on the bench. He sat very still for a long moment, looking at her. He did not try to rush in and fill the silence with easy comfort. He did not say it was the right call, or you did what you had to do, or any of the other things that people reach for when they want to make someone feel better without actually being willing to sit inside the pain with them. Instead, he said, "Does it hurt?" She looked at him. Her dark eyes were wet. He had never seen that before. He had not even known whether her species was capable of tears. "Yes," she said. "Good," Danny said softly. She flinched. "I don't mean good that people died," he said quickly. "I mean good that it hurts you, because if it didn't hurt, I would genuinely be worried. If you could make a decision like that and feel absolutely nothing afterward, then something would be seriously broken inside you. But it hurts. That means you still feel it. You still carry those 4,700 people inside you even though you couldn't save them." He paused for a moment. "The ones who stop caring entirely are the ones the rest of the galaxy should actually be afraid of, not you." Sale stared at him. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her chest rose and fell with a breath that shook visibly on its way in. Then another. Then her face came apart slowly and completely, the way a wall breaks down not from a sudden strike, but from a long accumulation of pressure, finally finding its release from the inside out. And she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically or with any performance in it. She cried the way someone cries who has not permitted themselves to do it in a very long time and perhaps has forgotten how. It came out in quiet and broken waves, her shoulders shaking in small movements, her hands pressed flat against her knees as though anchoring herself to the physical reality of the bench beneath her. The sound she made was barely a sound at all, just a thin and trembling exhale that carried more accumulated weight than any scream could have contained. Danny did not touch her. He did not reach over to hug her or take her hand or do any of the instinctive things. He understood without being able to explain it that sometimes when a person is genuinely falling apart, the worst thing you can do is try to hold them back together before they're ready. So he simply placed his hand on the bench between them, palm facing upward, fingers relaxed and open. Left it there available and present, not demanding anything, not making any claim. Just there. It took almost a full minute. Then Sale's hand moved slowly from her knee. Carefully, with the tentative quality of someone reaching for something they are not entirely certain they are allowed to have. Her fingers found his and curled around them. Her grip was tight. Her hand was very cold. Danny held on. 30 meters away, hidden carefully inside a maintenance corridor behind a ventilation access panel, two of the Empress's personal guards were watching through a concealed camera feed. One of them, a tall officer named Drell, reached for the release on his weapon harness. No one touched the Empress without explicit permission. No one. It was the first and most absolute law of the personal guard. Physical contact with the sovereign without prior authorization was grounds for immediate and forceful removal, and the guard did not use that particular word in its softer sense. But before Drell could complete the motion, the hand of the head of security, Commander Riss, pressed against his chest and stopped him with quiet but unmistakable firmness. Riss was old in her service. She had been at the Empress's side for 31 years without interruption. She had watched Sail close herself off from the world around her, layer by careful layer, year by year, until the woman who existed underneath had disappeared almost entirely behind the weight and the requirements of the title. Riss had watched her make impossible decisions without visible flinching, attend state funerals without allowing herself to weep, sit through ceremonies that would have broken people of lesser discipline, all of it without a single crack appearing in the surface she maintained for the world. Now, on a forgotten and insignificant bench on a station that did not appear on most standard navigation charts, she watched the Empress hold the hand of a human maintenance worker and cry for the first time in living memory. "Let her have this," Riss said quietly. Drell lowered his hand without argument. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. On the bench, Danny said nothing at all. He simply held on. And Sail, for the first time in 27 years, let someone see her without her armor in place. Sail told him on the 18th day. Danny arrived at the bench that afternoon and found her standing rather than sitting. That alone was the first indication that something was different about today. She always sat. She always waited with her hands in her lap, still and patient as a statue that had learned the minimum necessary movements to appear alive. But today she stood by the observation window with her arms at her sides and her back turned toward him, looking out at the docking bay below. "You're standing," Danny said, sitting down and reaching into his bag. "That's new. Should I be concerned?" She turned to face him. Her expression was composed and settled, but there was something underneath it, something careful and heavy that she was holding in position through visible effort. "I have to leave," she said. Danny's hand stopped moving inside the bag. He looked up at her. He had known this was coming in a general way from the beginning. She had always said she was traveling. Travelers leave eventually. That is the fundamental meaning of the word. But knowing something is coming and actually hearing it stated are two distinctly different experiences. "When?" he asked. "Tonight, my ship departs at the 20th hour." Danny nodded slowly. He reached into his bag and pulled out 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, 2 small cups of juice, and a cho. Colate bar he had been saving for an occasion that felt right. He arranged everything carefully on the bench between them, then reached into the bottom of his bag and retrieved a brown paper napkin. He had drawn a smiley face on it that morning with a pen borrowed from the supply closet, slightly crooked but recognizable. He placed it on top of her sandwich. "Here," he said, "lunch for the road." Sail looked at the spread on the bench. She looked at the napkin with its imperfect hand-drawn face. She looked at the chocolate bar sitting in its slightly crinkled wrapper. Something in her expression shifted in a way that was different from the other small shifts he had witnessed. Not a crack, not the edge of breaking. A softening, like ice beginning the slow process of returning to water. She sat down beside him. She picked up the napkin and held it carefully in both hands, staring at the drawn face with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing it. "Danny," she said, "I have not been completely honest with you about who I am." He looked at her. She was not smiling. She was not deflecting or redirecting the way she sometimes did. She met his eyes directly, and in them he saw something he had not seen there before. Not exhaustion, not the controlled distance she usually maintained. Fear. Not the fear of any physical danger, but the specific and more fragile fear of being about to lose something that had come to matter very much. "My name is Sail," she said. "That part is true, but I am not a traveler. I am not an administrator or an official or a merchant of any kind." She paused. The air between them felt heavier and more still. "I am the Empress of the Ascendancy. I rule over 914 species across 461 governed star systems. I command the largest unified military fleet in the known galaxy. Every law, every treaty, every military order issued within Ascendancy space passes through my hands and carries my authority." Danny blinked, then blinked again. then let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else he had a name for. "Okay," he said, "that's a very good one, you almost had me. It is not a joke. Sale, come on, you eat my sandwiches, you cried on this bench. You told me cheese was a crime against the concept of milk. You are not the empress of everything." "I am." He stared at her, waiting for the moment when her expression would crack into something closer to amusement and the joke would resolve itself. It did not come. Her face did not change. Her eyes did not move from his. Then a sound came from behind him. A sharp, synchronized click of boots on metal flooring, precise and unified. Danny turned around. 12 figures stepped out from positions he had never thought to look. From behind support columns. From inside maintenance alcoves he passed every day without registering. From shadows that had always appeared simply empty. They wore armor the color of deep space, black with thin lines of silver tracing through it like distant stars seen through smoked glass. And they moved with the specific kind of precision that only emerges from years of rigorous training layered on top of more years of absolute discipline. Each one carried a weapon at their side that Danny did not recognize by name, but understood immediately by purpose and by the way they held it. These were not station security personnel. These were not standard soldiers of any kind he had encountered. They formed a line behind Sale with practiced and silent efficiency. Then, in perfect and absolute unison, every single one of them dropped to one knee simultaneously. Their heads bowed forward. Their fists pressed firmly to their chests in a gesture that needed no translation. The docking bay corridor went completely silent. A fuel technician who had been walking past with a cargo manifest froze mid-stride, his mouth falling open. A dock worker dropped the crate he had been carrying. It hit the metal floor with a dull and echoing thud that carried clearly through the sudden and total quiet. Danny looked at the guards. He looked at Sale. He looked at the guards again. His mind moved carefully through each individual piece of information, the way a person wades through deep water, and then arrived all at once at the only shore available. "Oh," he said. Sale watched him, her dark eyes unreadable, her hand still holding the paper napkin with the slightly crooked smiley face on it. Danny looked at the 12 kneeling warriors. He looked at the woman he had been splitting his lunch with for 18 days. He looked at the arrangement of sandwiches and apple slices and juice cups on the bench between them. And then he said the first thing that actually came into his mind. "So did you actually like the sandwiches, or were you just being polite?" Sale stared at him. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then a sound came. From her that none of the 12 guards present had ever heard in all their years of combined service. A laugh. A real one. It started small, just a caught breath in her throat, and then it grew into something that shook her shoulders and pulled her lips apart into something wide and bright and entirely unguarded. She laughed the way a person laughs when they have spent so long forgetting that the rediscovery itself is part of what's funny. The guards did not move from their positions, but behind their helmets, careful glances were exchanged. Commander Riss, kneeling at the center of the line, felt something tighten in her chest in a way she had not experienced in many years. She had served the Empress for 3 decades across systems and seasons and impossible decisions. She had never heard that sound come from her. Danny sat on his bench, surrounded by the most highly trained and dangerous personal security force in the known galaxy, and waited patiently for an answer about the sandwiches. 3 weeks passed. Danny went back to fixing pipes and told himself it was fine. Life returned to its familiar rhythm without much difficulty. Wake up, shower, fix things, eat lunch on the bench, sleep. The only real difference was that the bench felt noticeably bigger than it used to, and the lunch bag was lighter each morning because he only packed for one again. The other workers on the station treated him differently after Sale's departure. Word had traveled fast. the way word always does in small and enclosed communities with not enough happening to keep everyone busy. The fuel technician who had frozen in the corridor had told everyone he knew within hours. Those people told everyone they knew. Within 2 days, the entire population of Relay Station 41 had heard the story of the maintenance worker who had been sharing his lunch with the Empress of the Ascendancy for 18 days without knowing it. People looked at Danny in the hallways with a complicated mixture of awe and genuine confusion, like he was either the bravest person any of them had ever encountered or the luckiest fool the galaxy had accidentally produced. Danny did not particularly feel like either description fit him. He just missed having someone to eat lunch with. He did not expect to hear from her again. Empresses did not maintain correspondence with pipe repair workers on forgotten stations at the edge of colonized space. That was simply not how the galaxy functioned. He figured their 18 days on the bench would eventually become a strange and warm memory that he would carry with him for the rest of his quiet life in this small corner of existence. And he told himself that would be enough. He almost believed it. Then the courier arrived. She came on an Ascendancy transport vessel so clean and polished it looked fundamentally wrong sitting in the station's docking bay, like a flawless diamond that had somehow been dropped onto a workbench covered in grease and old coffee. A tall alien in a formal silver uniform walked off the ship, asked for Danny Hale by name with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why, and presented him with a sealed message cylinder, engraved with symbols Danny did not recognize from any context he had previously encountered. The station commander, a thoroughly tired woman named Briggs who had not experienced a genuinely surprising day in 6 years of service, came very close to fainting on the spot. Danny opened the cylinder in his room, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed. Inside was a single sheet of material that felt like paper in his hands but shimmered faintly when he tilted it toward the light, like it couldn't quite decide what it was. The message was written in simple galactic common, plain and direct language without ceremony or formality. It read, "There's a bench in my garden. It has no view of a docking bay, but the flowers are considerably better than anything your station has to offer. I would like to eat lunch there with someone who doesn't want anything from me. If you're willing, a ship will come for you. Come as you are." See? Danny read it 3 times slowly, from the beginning each time. Then he packed a bag. It took him 4 minutes because he did not own a great deal. He put on his cleanest work jumpsuit, the dark blue one with only 2 small stains near the left pocket, and he packed a lunch. 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, a chocolate bar, and a napkin with a smiley face drawn on it. The journey to the Ascendancy capital took 6 days. Danny spent most of it sitting at the viewport of the transport ship, staring out at things he had never imagined he would see with his own eyes. Nebulae that burned in colors he didn't have names for yet, as though the universe had invented new shades specifically for the occasion. Space stations the size of small moons, their lights visible from distances that made his mind reach for the right scale and come up slightly short. Fleets of ships that moved together through the dark like silver rivers, finding their way between stars. He was a man who had spent 4 years in a metal box at the outermost edge of inhabited space. And now, the galaxy was unfolding in front of him like a book he had never quite gathered the courage to open. The capital world was called Aleth. It was beautiful in a way that did something unexpected to Danny's chest, a tightening that took him a moment to identify as the physical sensation of encountering something genuinely beyond expectation. White towers rose from a landscape of deep green, connected by bridges that curved with the kind of graceful arc that suggested whoever designed them had thought more about music than engineering. The sky was a pale and warm gold, and the air carried a scent that sat somewhere between rain and flowers without being precisely either. Ships moved overhead in patterns that were clearly organized but that felt, from below, almost like the sky was alive with deliberate and purposeful motion. The streets were filled with species Danny had never encountered before, walking and moving and living alongside each other in ways that made Relay Station 41 feel like a very small and very specific idea about what existing could be. He was escorted through halls that could have contained his entire station comfortably within them, and still had room left over for several more. Officials stopped and stared as he passed. Diplomats leaned together and whispered things he couldn't hear. A group of alien dignitaries who had been in what appeared to be an important conversation came to a complete stop and watched the human in the stained blue work jumpsuit walk past them with a paper lunch bag held in one hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then he saw her. Sale stood at the entrance to a private garden situated behind the central palace. She wore white and silver now, the formal dress of her actual station, and she looked entirely and unmistakably like the ruler of 914 species. But when her eyes found Danny across the distance between them, something in her face changed in the way he recognized from the bench. The careful mask softened at its edges, the accumulated weight shifted just slightly, and for a moment she was simply the tired woman at the far end of a bench again, holding half a sandwich and deciding whether to trust something new. Danny walked up to her, smiled the way he always had, and held up the lunch bag. "I brought the good mustard this time," he said. She almost smiled. Then she did smile. Then she turned and led him into the garden. It was the most beautiful place Danny had ever stood inside. Trees with silver bark and leaves that held a faint blue glow that brightened and dimmed in slow rhythm. Flowers that opened and closed with a movement like breathing, as though the garden itself was quietly alive in some way that went beyond what plants usually managed. A small stream wound its way between smooth, pale stones, and made a sound as it moved that was close enough to quiet laughter to make Danny feel like something nearby was gently pleased about something. And in the center of it all, a bench. Simple stone, worn smooth, just wide enough for two people to sit comfortably side by side. They sat down. Danny opened the bag and handed her a sandwich. She took it without hesitation and without ceremony. They ate in silence for a while, exactly the way they always had from the very first day, and the silence between them was the most comfortable thing Danny had encountered in a very long time. Perhaps the most comfortable thing in that particular corner of the galaxy on that particular afternoon. Centuries later, a historian named Paulus wrote what would become the most widely referenced passage in galactic academic literature on the subject of human civilization and its influence on the broader story of interstellar history. It appeared in a long study about humanity's role in shaping the relationships between species across the known galaxy. And it said this: "We studied humans for generations before we believed we understood them. We measured their physical strength, their speed, their capacity for organized violence and sustained warfare. We analyzed their technology, their tactical thinking, their extraordinary instincts for survival under pressure. We prepared ourselves for their aggression when it came. We made detailed plans for their ambition as it grew, but we entirely missed the thing that actually changed everything. A human will give half his lunch to a stranger and ask for nothing in return. He will sit beside someone who carries the weight of an entire galaxy on her shoulders and simply offer to share whatever small portion of that weight he can reach. He will make the most powerful being in the known universe laugh out loud, not through strategy or calculation or force of any kind, but through a kindness so ordinary and so unconsidered that no one thought to build any kind of defense against it. The galaxy was not reshaped by human weapons or human ambition. It was undone, gently and permanently, by human kindness.